November 1950. I'd been in Korea for 4 months by then, long enough to think I understood what I was getting into, long enough to be wrong. I was with the 1st Marine Division, part of the push north after Incheon. That landing had been brilliant, MacArthur's masterstroke that cut the North Korean army in half and sent them running back across the 38th parallel. We'd chased them all the way to the Chinese border. Victory seemed certain. Everyone said we'd be home by Christmas. The cold hit us first. Late November in North Korea, and the temperature was already dropping below zero. We weren't prepared for it. Summer uniforms, light jackets, equipment that wasn't designed for Arctic conditions. The brass hadn't planned for a winter war. Thought it would be over before the cold came. They were wrong about a lot of things. We moved up toward the Chosin Reservoir in late November. It was a massive artificial lake in the mountains of northeastern Korea, created by a hydroelectric dam. Strategic location. The roads around it were the main supply route connecting the eastern and western halves of the UN advance. Control the reservoir, control the route north. The terrain was brutal. Mountains rising thousands of feet on either side of narrow, winding roads, dense forests, valleys that turned into wind tunnels, and cold. God, the cold. 20 below zero at night, 30 below. Your breath would freeze on your face. Your hands would go numb inside your gloves. Your rifle would freeze if you didn't keep it warm against your body. We'd been hearing rumors about Chinese troops. Intelligence said they'd crossed the Yalu River, were operating in North Korea. But command dismissed it. Said it was just volunteers, not the main Chinese army. Said they wouldn't dare intervene. Said we had nothing to worry about. The Chinese had other plans. I was a rifleman in a rifle company. Lowest rank, hardest job. Same as every war. We'd been fighting since Incheon. Street fighting in Seoul, pushing north through villages and rice paddies. Occasional contact with retreating North Korean forces. It had been tough, but manageable. We were winning. The reservoir area was different, more isolated, more exposed. We were stretched thin, units scattered along the road, separated by miles of mountain terrain. Our supply line ran back 78 miles to the port of Hongnam on the coast. One road. That was it. If that road got cut, we were trapped. We set up positions around the reservoir in late November. My company was near Udamni, a small village on the western side. Other Marine units were scattered at different positions. Hagaruri to the south, Kotori further down the road. Army units held positions even further south. We were supposed to continue the advance west, push to the Yalu, finish the war. The nights were the worst. The temperature would plummet after sunset. We'd huddle in our sleeping bags, trying to generate enough warmth to survive until morning. Some guys would share bags, 2 men pressed together for heat. Your rations would freeze solid, had to thaw them against your body before you could eat. Water froze in your canteen. Morphine syrettes froze, useless for treating the wounded. Equipment failed constantly. Batteries died in the cold. Vehicle engines wouldn't start. Weapons malfunctioned. We learned to keep our M1 rifles inside our bags at night, pressed against our bodies. Otherwise, the firing mechanisms would freeze, and you'd have a useless chunk of metal in your hands. November 27th. The temperature dropped to 25 below zero. Wind was howling down from Siberia, cutting through everything. We were dug in around Udamni, about 14,000 Marines in total. Orders were to attack west the next morning, continue the advance. We never made that attack. Around 2,200 hours, the Chinese hit us. Not probes, not small units, entire divisions. They came out of the mountains in human waves, blowing bugles, blowing whistles, screaming. Tens of thousands of them, maybe more. They'd been hiding in the mountains for days, watching us, waiting. And when they attacked everywhere at once. The noise was incredible. Bugles echoing off the mountains, whistles, the strange warbling calls they used to communicate, grenades exploding, machine guns firing, mortars landing, and underneath it all the sound of thousands of men running, shouting, dying. I was in a foxhole when the first wave hit. Saw them coming up the hill in the darkness, illuminated by flares and muzzle flashes. Hundreds of them, moving fast despite the cold, despite the terrain. They were wearing quilted uniforms, canvas shoes. Most didn't have proper winter gear either, but they kept coming. We fired into the mass. Couldn't miss. There were too many of them. Men fell, but more kept coming. They'd hit our positions in waves. First wave would be cut down, second wave would climb over the bodies, third wave would break through. It was overwhelming, terrifying, like trying to stop the ocean with a bucket. They broke through our lines in several places, hand-to-hand fighting in the darkness, bayonets, rifle butts, desperate struggling in the snow. I killed men that night at arm's length, close enough to see their faces, to smell them, to feel them die. It wasn't combat. It was slaughter, on both sides. By dawn on November 28th, we understood the situation. We weren't facing volunteers or remnants. This was the Chinese army, multiple divisions, over 100,000 troops, and they'd surrounded us completely, cut the road south, isolated every Marine position around the reservoir. We were trapped. 14,000 Marines at Udamni, 3,000 more at Hagaruri, another 1,000 at Kotori, all cut off, surrounded by Chinese forces that outnumbered us 10 to 1, with winter closing in, supplies running low, and 78 miles of frozen mountain road between us and safety. Command called it a fighting withdrawal. We called it something else, called it survival, called it the longest retreat in Marine Corps history, called it hell frozen over. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir had begun, and for the next 17 days, we'd fight for our lives in the worst conditions imaginable, against an enemy that seemed limitless, in cold that could kill you as surely as a bullet. Home by Christmas, that's what they'd said. We'd be lucky to survive until December. November 28th. Dawn revealed the scale of what we were facing. The hills around Udamni were covered with Chinese dead. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They'd paid a terrible price for their attacks, but they'd accomplished their objective. We were surrounded, completely cut off. The road south to Hagaruri was blocked. Chinese forces had taken the high ground on both sides, turned it into a gauntlet of fire. Anyone trying to move down that road would be slaughtered. We were stuck in Udamni with limited supplies, no reinforcements, and an enemy that seemed to have infinite numbers. The cold was worse than the day before, 30 below zero. The wind made it feel even colder. Frostbite was already claiming casualties. Guys would wake up with blackened fingers or toes. In some cases, you could break them off like icicles. The corpsmen tried to treat it, but there wasn't much they could do. In that kind of cold, exposed skin froze in minutes. The wounded were suffering terribly. We had hundreds of casualties from the night's fighting, and more coming in constantly. The aid stations were overwhelmed. Blood froze before you could transfuse it. Plasma froze in the bottles. Morphine was useless, frozen solid. Men would lie there in agony while the corpsmen tried desperately to help them with equipment that didn't work. The dead froze solid within hours. Bodies became rigid as stone. We'd stack them like cordwood because we couldn't bury them. The ground was frozen too hard to dig. Just stacked them and covered them with ponchos and moved on. No time for anything else. No dignity, no ceremony, just survival. Supply was critical. We had maybe 3 days of ammunition if the fighting stayed intense. Food was running low. Medical supplies were inadequate. And there was no way to get more unless we could break through to Hagaru-ri or they could break through to us. The Air Force tried to help. C-47s and C-119 would fly over and drop supplies by parachute. But the wind would catch the chutes, blow them into Chinese positions. We'd watch desperately needed ammunition and food drift into enemy hands. Sometimes the chutes wouldn't open and the supplies would slam into the frozen ground and shatter. We salvaged what we could, but it wasn't enough. The Chinese attacked again the night of November 28th. Same pattern, bugles, whistles, human waves. We were better prepared this time, had adjusted our defensive positions, had learned that you couldn't let them get close or they'd overwhelm you through sheer numbers, had to stop them with sustained fire while they were still far enough away. We fired until our barrels glowed red, fired until our ammunition ran low, fired until our hands were so cold we could barely pull the trigger. And still they came, wave after wave. They'd blow bugles to signal attacks. We learned to recognize the different calls. One pattern meant assault. Another meant withdraw. A third meant shift focus to a different position. Artillery was our lifeline. We had a few 105mm howitzers set up, and they fired continuously. Danger close fire missions, shells landing within 50 yards of our own positions. The crews worked in shifts around the clock through the cold that made the metal so brittle it could crack. They saved us repeatedly, breaking up Chinese attacks before they could overrun our positions. But the Chinese were learning too. They'd probe our defenses, find the weak points, concentrate their forces there. They'd use the terrain, the darkness, the cold. They knew these mountains. We were strangers here, and it showed. November 29th. Command made the decision. We couldn't stay at Udamni, couldn't hold against the Chinese numbers, had to break out, fight our way south to Hagaru-ri. 14,000 Marines, over 1,000 wounded, all the equipment we could carry, fighting through Chinese positions for 14 miles of frozen mountain road. They called it an attack in a different direction, not a retreat. Marines don't retreat. We were attacking to the south. The semantics didn't change what it was. We were surrounded and fighting for survival. We spent November 29th preparing. Destroyed equipment we couldn't take. Consolidated supplies. Organized the wounded. Prepared to move out on the 30th. The temperature dropped to 40 below zero. Men were collapsing from the cold alone. No wounds, just the cold shutting down their bodies. I saw guys with frostbite so bad their feet were black to the ankles. They could barely walk. But they had to walk anyway because if you couldn't walk, you got loaded on a truck with the seriously wounded, and those trucks would be primary targets for Chinese fire. Better to walk if you possibly could. November 30th. We started the breakout before dawn. The plan was simple in concept, brutal in execution. Lead elements would attack south, try to clear the road. Main body would follow with the wounded and equipment. Rear guard would hold off Chinese attacks from behind. And all of this in 40 below zero weather, through mountains held by an enemy that outnumbered us massively. The fighting started immediately. The Chinese held every ridge, every hill, every piece of high ground along the route. We had to take each position one at a time, fighting uphill in the snow and ice. It was exhausting, deadly, slow. I was with the main column. We'd move a few hundred yards, then stop while the lead elements cleared the next obstacle. Stop while artillery pounded Chinese positions. Stop while engineers tried to repair blown bridges or clear roadblocks. And all the while, the Chinese were hitting us from the sides, from behind, probing for weaknesses. The convoy stretched for miles, trucks loaded with wounded, with supplies, with equipment. Vehicles kept breaking down in the cold. Engines freezing, batteries dying. We'd have to stop and get them moving again or abandon them. Every abandoned vehicle meant less transportation for the wounded, meant someone who couldn't walk would have to try. The Chinese would infiltrate our column. hide in the hills until part of the convoy passed, then attack the middle or rear. Cut us into segments, try to destroy us piece by piece. We'd have to stop, fight them off, reconnect the column, then keep moving. It turned the 14-mile journey into a continuous running battle. Air support was crucial. Marine corsairs would fly low over the mountains, strafing Chinese positions, dropping napalm, giving us breathing room. The pilots were incredible, flying in weather that should have grounded them, making runs so close to our positions we could feel the heat from their napalm. They saved us countless times. But night was coming, and at night the Chinese owned the darkness. We'd have to keep moving through the night or we'd be sitting ducks. Keep moving in 40 below temperatures through enemy fire, carrying our wounded, fighting every step of the way. By late afternoon on November 30th, we'd made maybe 4 miles. 10 miles still to go. Hundreds more casualties. Ammunition running low again, and the temperature still dropping. A sergeant I knew, Miller from Philadelphia, he'd been with the Corps since the Pacific War. Seen Guadalcanal, Peleliu, Okinawa. He looked at the mountains ahead, at the Chinese positions we'd still have to fight through, at the wounded piling up faster than we could treat them. He just shook his head. Didn't say anything. Didn't need to. We all knew what we were facing. We were in the middle of the worst retreat in Marine Corps history, fighting an enemy that seemed endless, in cold that was killing us as surely as the bullets. And we still had 10 miles to go. 10 miles through hell. 10 miles that would take 3 more days and cost hundreds more lives. But we'd make it, somehow. We were Marines. We'd fight. We'd carry our wounded. We'd bring out our dead. And we'd make it to Hagaruri, or die trying. The nights were the worst. December 1st, moving through the darkness, the temperature hit 45 below zero. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable. It was a weapon, as deadly as any bullet. Your eyelashes would freeze together. You'd have to physically pry your eyes open. Your nostrils would freeze shut when you breathed. Exhaled moisture would ice up on your face, forming a mask of frost. Your clothes would stiffen into armor. Every movement took twice the effort. We kept moving because stopping meant freezing to death. Simple as that. Guys would sit down to rest and never get up. Just fall asleep in the cold and not wake up. We'd find them in the morning, frozen, solid, peaceful expressions on their faces. At least they didn't suffer long. The wounded suffered most. Lying on trucks, unable to move, the cold would seep into them. We'd wrap them in whatever we could find. Sleeping bags, blankets, parachutes from supply drops. Didn't matter. In that cold, if you couldn't generate your own heat, you died. We lost men to cold who would have survived their wounds anywhere else. The Chinese kept attacking. They didn't stop, didn't seem affected by the cold the same way we were. They'd appear out of the darkness, hit our column, melt back into the mountains. We'd return fire at muzzle flashes, at shadows, at sounds. Half the time couldn't tell if we'd hit anything. Just fired and hoped. December 1st into 2nd, we fought for a pass called Tok Tong. The Chinese held the high ground on both sides. We had to go through it, no other route. They poured fire down on us from positions we couldn't see. Mortars, machine guns, small arms. The column was trapped, vehicles burning, wounded piling up. Fox Company had been holding a hill position near the pass for days, surrounded, cut off, down to half strength. But they held because if they didn't, the Chinese would control the pass completely and we'd never get through. 200 Marines holding against thousands of Chinese for 3 days and nights in below zero temperatures. By the time we reached them, they had maybe half their men left standing. The rest were casualties or frozen corpses. We pushed through Tok Tong on December 2nd. Left behind burning vehicles. Left behind equipment we couldn't carry. Left behind some of the dead because we couldn't recover them all. Every Marine who could be moved, we moved. But the frozen dead, the ones buried under snow or behind enemy lines, they stayed. That bothered us more than anything. Marines don't leave Marines behind. That's the code. But in Chosin, we had to. Had to choose between the living and the dead. Had to abandon bodies to save the wounded. It violated everything we believed in, but survival required it. The frostbite casualties were staggering. Worse than combat casualties in many cases. Guys would lose fingers, toes, feet, hands. The corpsman would cut away boots and find feet that were solid black. Dead tissue. Would have to be amputated eventually, but we couldn't do that in the field. Just wrapped them and kept moving. I lost 2 toes on my left foot. Didn't even notice until someone pointed out I was limping. Took off my boot and the toes were black. Corpsman looked at it, wrapped it, told me to keep walking. Nothing else to do. The pain came later, after the cold had numbed everything. Felt like my foot was on fire once we reached somewhere warm enough to thaw. Food was a constant problem. Sea rations frozen solid. We'd try to thaw them over small fires when we stopped, but fires drew Chinese mortars. So mostly we ate them frozen. Chocolate bars that could break your teeth. Meat that was like chewing ice. Some guys gave up eating entirely. Just drank what water they could melt and kept going on willpower alone. Sleep was impossible. You couldn't sleep in that cold. Couldn't let yourself. If you slept, you might not wake up. So we stayed awake through sheer determination, through fear, through the knowledge that sleep meant death. Days blurred together into one long, continuous nightmare of cold and combat and exhaustion. December 3rd, we finally reached Hagaruri, what was left of the Udam-Ni force, maybe 10,000 men, down from 14,000. Over 1,500 casualties. Hundreds more with frostbite. Equipment lost, vehicles destroyed. But we'd made it. 14 miles in 4 days. Every mile paid for in blood and suffering. Hagaruri wasn't safety. It was just another surrounded position. But it had an airstrip. C-47s were flying in supplies and flying out the worst of the wounded. Seeing those planes land and take off, that gave us hope. First hope we'd felt since this nightmare began. We had maybe a day to rest, eat hot food, get some actual sleep in warming tents, clean weapons, reorganize. Then we'd have to move again. Had to continue south to Kotori, then further south to Hungnam and the coast. Still 40 miles to go. 40 miles of frozen mountains and Chinese positions. But first, 1 day of rest. 1 day to thaw out. 1 day to treat the wounded and count the dead and try to process what we'd already been through. I sat in a warming tent on December 3rd, eating hot food for the first time in days, feeling returning to my frozen limbs. Around me, other Marines were doing the same. Nobody talked much. Too exhausted, too traumatized. Just sat there, grateful to be warm, grateful to be alive. A lieutenant came through checking on the men. He'd lost part of his ear to frostbite. His hands were wrapped in bandages, but he was still on his feet, still leading. He stopped and looked at us. Didn't say we'd done well or that the worst was over. Didn't give any speeches. Just said we'd move out again tomorrow and to get what rest we could. Then he moved on to the next tent. We all knew what tomorrow meant. More fighting, more cold, more casualties. Another 40 miles of hell. But we also knew we'd do it. Had to do it. No choice. The only way out was through. Outside the tent, the temperature was still dropping. 50 below zero now. The coldest it had been yet. The wind howled across the frozen reservoir, carrying with it the sounds of distant fighting. The Chinese were still out there, still surrounding us, still attacking the perimeter. Tomorrow we'd face them again. Would fight through more mountains. would lose more men, would suffer more from the cold that never stopped, never gave mercy, never allowed rest. But tonight, for a few hours, we were warm. We were fed. We were alive. In Chosin, that was victory enough. Tomorrow could wait. Tonight, we'd survived another day. That was all anyone could ask. December 6th. We left Hagaruri in the early morning darkness. The entire 1st Marine Division, what was left of it, moving south as one massive column. Over 10,000 men, 1,400 vehicles, thousands of wounded, all trying to reach Kotori, 11 miles away. 11 miles. Should have been a few hours. Took us 38 hours of continuous fighting. The Chinese knew our route, had to. Only one road through the mountains. They'd prepared ambush positions at every turn, every pass, every bridge. We'd fight for 100 yards, then fight for the next 100. The column would stretch for miles, vulnerable, exposed, under constant attack. The cold was relentless, still 40 to 50 below. We'd been in it for over a week now. The cumulative effect was devastating. Even the guys who weren't hit by frostbite were slowing down. Hypothermia setting in. Bodies conserving energy, shutting down non-essential functions. We moved like old men shuffling forward, barely able to lift our weapons. The engineers saved us repeatedly. Every bridge the Chinese tried to blow, the engineers would repair it or build a bypass. They'd work under fire, in the freezing cold, hands so numb they could barely hold tools. One bridge was completely destroyed. Engineers built a new one using air-dropped bridge sections. Took them hours, working through the night while we held off Chinese attacks. Without them, we'd never have made it. The Air Force and Marine Aviation flew constantly. Weather that should have grounded them, they flew anyway. Corsairs making napalm runs so close we'd feel the heat. C-47s dropping supplies. They coordinated with our advance, hitting Chinese positions just ahead of our lead elements. Some pilots flew multiple missions a day, landing to refuel and rearm, then going right back up. Heroes, every one of them. But planes couldn't hold ground. That was on us. We'd take a hill, the Chinese would counterattack, we'd have to take it again. Sometimes 3 or 4 times for the same piece of frozen rock. Each time costing casualties we couldn't afford. The wounded kept mounting. Every truck bed was full of casualties. Some trucks carried nothing but wounded, stacked like cordwood because there was no room to lay them out. They'd cry out when the trucks hit bumps, when the cold got too intense, when the pain became unbearable. The corpsmen did what they could, but there were too many and too few supplies. I saw things at Chosin I'll never forget. Saw a Marine with both legs frozen solid, still firing his rifle from a truck bed. Saw a corpsman working on wounded with hands so frostbitten his fingers were black, working until he physically couldn't anymore, then collapsing. Saw officers who should have been evacuated refusing to leave, staying with their men, leading from the front despite wounds and frostbite. Saw a Chinese prisoner, young kid, maybe 18, freezing to death because we had no warm clothes to give him. We shared what little food we had. Tried to keep him warm. He died anyway. Just the cold. The Chinese were suffering too. We'd find their frozen bodies scattered across the hills. They were losing men to the cold at rates probably worse than ours. But they had the numbers. Could afford the losses in ways we couldn't. December 7th, we reached Kotori, another surrounded position, but one step closer to the coast. From Kotori to Hungnam was still 29 miles. One more push, one more section of road held by Chinese forces. One more series of battles in the killing cold. We consolidated at Kotori for a day. Same routine, hot food, warming tents, treat the wounded, count the dead, prepare to move again. By then, we'd lost over 3,000 casualties, combat losses and frostbite combined. We'd killed far more Chinese. Estimates were running as high as 30 or 40,000 enemy casualties. but it didn't feel like winning, felt like barely surviving. The breakout from Cotorie started December 8th. This time we had the remnants of an army unit with us. Task Force Faith had been surrounded further east, had tried to fight their way out. Most of them had been killed or captured. The survivors, maybe 100 men from an original force of 3,000, joined our column. They'd been through hell that made our hell look merciful. Their commanding officer was dead. Most of their wounded had frozen to death. They were ghosts, barely functional, moving on instinct alone. The road from Cotorie descended from the mountains to the coastal plain. 4,000 feet of elevation change over 29 miles. The Chinese held the high ground the entire way. We had to fight downhill, which sounds easier but wasn't. They could rain fire down on us while we struggled with icy roads and frozen equipment. Funchulin Pass was the worst. A narrow mountain road with a 1,000-foot drop on one side. The Chinese had blown a bridge, a crucial bridge that couldn't be bypassed. Without it, the entire column was stuck. Sitting ducks for Chinese artillery. The engineers performed a miracle. Air Force C-19s dropped bridge sections by parachute. The engineers assembled them under fire in below-zero temperatures, working on a cliff edge where one mistake meant death. Took them hours. We held the perimeter, fighting off Chinese attacks while they worked. Finally got the bridge in place. Tested it with a tank. It held. The column moved across. December 9th and 10th, we continued south. The fighting was less intense now. The Chinese were pulling back, either because they'd exhausted themselves or because they knew we were getting close to the coast and naval gunfire support. Or maybe they'd bled us enough and were satisfied with that. But the cold remained, still 40 below at night, still claiming casualties. Men who'd survived combat, survived Udam Ni and Hagaru Ri and Kotori, dying from cold in the final miles, so close to safety, so close to the sea and evacuation. But the cold didn't care how close you were. It took you anyway. December 11th, we reached Hungnam, the port, the sea, Navy ships waiting offshore. We'd made it, 78 miles from the Chosin Reservoir to the coast, 17 days of continuous combat, minus 50-degree temperatures, surrounded by Chinese forces that outnumbered us 10-1. And we'd made it, brought out our wounded, brought out most of our dead, brought out our equipment. The 1st Marine Division had fought its way out of encirclement and survived. They called it a retreat, called it a defeat. The newspapers back home made it sound like we'd been beaten, forced to run, made it sound like the Chinese had won. We knew different. We'd been surrounded by 10 Chinese divisions. They'd thrown everything they had at us, and we'd fought through them, inflicted casualties they couldn't afford, maintained unit cohesion, completed a fighting withdrawal that military historians would study for decades. But it didn't feel like victory. Felt like we'd survived something that should have killed us. Felt like we'd paid a price that would haunt us forever. Felt like we'd left something behind in those frozen mountains that we'd never get back. Loading onto the ships at Hungnam, seeing the frozen mountains recede into the distance, I felt nothing. No relief, no joy, just emptiness. Just exhaustion so complete it went beyond physical. Soul exhaustion, the kind you don't recover from. We'd survived Chosin, but Chosin would never let us go. Those mountains, that cold, those battles, they'd stay with us forever. Every man who fought there carried those 17 days like a weight that couldn't be lifted. The frozen Chosin, they started calling it. The battle where more Marines became casualties to cold than to combat. The battle that shouldn't have been fought. The battle we somehow survived. We'd made it to the ships, made it to evacuation, made it to what passed for safety, but we'd never really leave Chosin. Part of us would always be there, always fighting, always freezing, always dying in those mountains, forever. My breaking point didn't come during the fighting, didn't come during the worst of the cold or the heaviest combat. It came after we'd evacuated from Hungnam, after we were safe aboard the ships, after the immediate danger had passed. We were transported to Busan for rest and reorganization. They put us in warming barracks, gave us hot food, clean uniforms, medical attention, tried to help us recover. The medics treated my frostbitten toes, ended up losing 2 of them to amputation. Other guys lost more: fingers, feet, hands, ears, noses. The cold had taken its toll even on those who'd survived combat. But the physical wounds were manageable, expected. You could see them, treat them, heal them. The other wounds, the ones you couldn't see, those were different. I couldn't get warm. That's what I remember most about those first days after Chosin. No matter how many blankets, how hot the room, how much hot food and coffee I consumed, I couldn't get warm. The cold had settled into my bones, into my soul. I'd shiver uncontrollably even when sweating. Couldn't sleep either. The second I closed my eyes, I was back there, back in the mountains, back in the 40 below darkness with Chinese bugles echoing off the hills, back watching guys freeze to death, back stepping over bodies frozen solid in the road. The dreams were so vivid, so real, that waking up was disorienting. Had to remind myself I was safe, that the cold was gone, that I'd survived. 3 weeks after we'd evacuated, they held a formation, roll call for the division. Unit by unit, they called out names. So many didn't answer. Dead or wounded so badly they'd been evacuated to Japan or the States. My company started with over 200 men. After Chosin, we had maybe 60 left. The rest were gone. They called out Williams. No answer. Thomas. No answer. Rodriguez. No answer. Name after name, silence after silence. Each silence was a man I'd known, had fought beside, had watched die or disappear in the chaos. The roster call seemed to go on forever. A litany of the dead and wounded that made the cost of Chosin real in a way the fighting hadn't. Something broke in me during that formation. Not dramatically, not with tears or screaming or any obvious sign, just quietly cracked and fell away. The part of me that had been holding it together, functioning, surviving, it stopped working. After formation, I went back to the barracks, sat on my bunk, stared at nothing. One of the guys asked if I was okay. I nodded, lied. I wasn't okay, wouldn't be okay, knew it with absolute certainty. I'd survived 17 days of hell, survived cold that killed men without firing a shot, survived being surrounded and outnumbered and fighting through mountains in conditions that should have been impossible. I'd done everything right, followed orders, fought well, helped my buddies, completed the mission. And for what? So many dead, so many maimed. For a reservoir we'd abandoned anyway. For ground we'd given back to the Chinese. For a war that would grind on for 2 more years and end in stalemate. What had any of it accomplished? I started having panic attacks. The warming barracks would suddenly feel too hot, too confined. I'd have to get outside into the cold just to breathe. But the cold would trigger memories of Chosin. So I'd be trapped. Couldn't be warm, couldn't be cold, couldn't find any temperature that didn't drag me back to those mountains. The nightmares got worse. Started dreaming about the ones we'd left behind, the frozen bodies we couldn't recover. They'd appear in my dreams, accusing me, asking why I'd survived when they didn't, asking why I'd left them in those mountains. I had no answers. Still don't. January 1951. They declared us combat ready again. The division had received replacements, fresh troops who hadn't been at Chosin. They mixed them in with us veterans, diluting the units, trying to rebuild our strength. The new guys looked at us like we were ghosts. Maybe we were. But I couldn't do it. Couldn't go back to the fighting. Couldn't face combat again. The thought of being in danger, of being cold, of seeing more people die, it paralyzed me. I'd fought through Chosin on pure survival instinct. Now that the immediate danger was gone, that instinct had burned out. Left me empty. Used up. Done. I went to the medics. Told them I couldn't function. Couldn't sleep. Couldn't eat. Couldn't control the shaking or the panic or the nightmares. They examined me, asked questions, diagnosed combat fatigue, said I needed rest, more time to recover. But there was no recovering from Chosin. Not really. You didn't get over something like that. You just learned to live with it. Or you didn't live at all. They sent me to a hospital in Japan, psychiatric evaluation. Weeks of doctors asking about my experiences, my feelings, my symptoms. I told them what I could. Left out most of it because most of it couldn't be put into words. How do you explain cold that kills? How do you describe watching friends freeze to death? How do you make someone understand that 17 days in hell changed you so fundamentally that you're not sure who you are anymore? They gave me a medical discharge, March 1951. Said I'd served honorably but wasn't fit for further duty. Gave me papers, medals, sent me home. Just like that. One day you're a Marine, next day you're a civilian with a medical discharge and a head full of nightmares. The ship back to the States was full of wounded, physical casualties mostly, amputees, burn victims, guys who'd lost eyes or limbs. I was one of the few psychiatric cases. Felt like a fraud among them. They'd lost parts of their bodies. I'd just lost my mind. Seemed less legitimate somehow. Landing in San Francisco was surreal. Just walked off the ship into America, into a world that had no idea what we'd been through. People were going about their normal lives, shopping, working, complaining about trivial things, and I'd just come from mountains where men froze to death standing up. The disconnect was staggering. My family met me at the train station in my hometown. They cried, hugged me, said they were so glad I was home safe. I stood there feeling nothing. Couldn't connect to their emotions. Couldn't feel the relief or joy they wanted me to feel. Just felt empty, hollow, like I'd left the parts of me that could feel anything back in Korea. I was 20 years old. Had been in Korea for 8 months, had survived one of the most brutal battles in Marine Corps history, had a medical discharge, a Purple Heart for my frostbite injuries, and trauma that would define the rest of my life. I'd made it home, but I hadn't really survived. The person I'd been before Chosin, the kid who'd enlisted thinking war would be an adventure, he'd frozen to death in those mountains along with everyone else. What came home was just a shell, a ghost pretending to be alive. My breaking point wasn't a single moment. It was the gradual realization that I'd been broken by Chosin in ways that couldn't be fixed, that the cold and the death and the horror had taken something essential from me, something I'd never get back. I'd survived the frozen Chosin, but surviving wasn't the same as living, and I wouldn't really live again. Would just exist, go through the motions, carry those 17 days like a weight that grew heavier with each passing year. Chosin had ended in December 1950. But for those of us who fought there, who survived it, Chosin never ended. It continued in our nightmares, in our panic attacks, in our inability to ever truly be warm again. We'd escaped those mountains. But the mountains never let us go. Coming home to civilian life was harder than surviving Chosin. At least in Korea, I'd known what to expect, knew the enemy, knew the mission. Home was different, had to figure out how to be normal again, how to be the person everyone expected me to be. I couldn't do it. Got a job at a factory. Lasted 3 months. Couldn't handle being inside, the heat from the machinery, the confined spaces. Would have panic attacks on the floor. Had to quit before they fired me. Tried construction after that. Outdoor work seemed better. But winter came and the cold triggered memories so intense I'd freeze up, unable to function. Lost that job too. The cold was the worst part. Every winter for the rest of my life, the cold would bring it back. The temperature would drop and I'd be back in those mountains. Back fighting through the snow. Back watching men freeze. I'd wear layers of clothing even in moderate cold. People thought I was crazy. Maybe I was. But I couldn't stand being cold. Couldn't tolerate it even for a minute. Sleep never came easy. The nightmares continued. Decades later, I'd still wake up in the night, back at Chosin, feeling the cold, hearing the bugles. My wife, I married eventually, though it took years, learned to sleep in another room, said my screaming kept her awake, said she couldn't handle waking up to find me thrashing, reliving battles she couldn't understand. I tried to talk about it once, with a therapist the VA sent me to in the 60s. Tried to explain what Chosin had been like, the cold, the fighting, the dying, the frozen bodies, the feeling of being surrounded and slowly destroyed. He nodded, took notes, said things like, "That must have been difficult, and how did that make you feel?" How did it make me feel? The question was absurd. It didn't make me feel anything. It destroyed my ability to feel, hollowed me out, left me incapable of connecting to emotions the way normal people did. But I couldn't explain that. Couldn't make him understand that you don't process trauma like Chosin. You just carry it. I stopped going to therapy, stopped trying to talk about it. What was the point? Nobody who wasn't there could understand. Nobody who hadn't felt that cold, hadn't fought in those mountains, hadn't seen what we'd seen. They couldn't comprehend it. The gap was too wide, so I stopped trying to bridge it. The Korean War became the Forgotten War. That's what they called it. Wedged between World War II and Vietnam, overshadowed by both, largely ignored by history. People would ask about my service, and when I said Korea, they'd nod vaguely. Some didn't even know there'd been a war there. Thousands of Americans died in Korea, and most people couldn't tell you why or when or what we'd accomplished. Chosin especially got forgotten. The retreat, the defeat, not the glorious victory story people wanted to hear. So it faded from public memory. The veterans knew. We carried it. But the country moved on, forgot about the frozen mountains and the Marines who fought there. I connected with other Chosin veterans over the years. We'd find each other somehow, recognize something in each other's eyes, that shared knowledge of what we'd survived. We didn't talk about it much, didn't need to. Just knowing someone else understood, someone else carried the same weight. That helped more than any therapy. One reunion in the 80s, I met a guy from Fox Company, the ones who'd held Tok Tong Pass while we fought our way through. He'd lost both feet to frostbite, walked on prosthetics, been walking on them for 30 years. He looked at me and said 2 words, "Still cold." I nodded. He nodded back. That was the entire conversation. But it said everything. 30 years later, and we were both still cold, still carrying Chosin, still unable to escape those 17 days that had defined the rest of our lives. My children asked about the war when they were young, asked what I'd done, where I'd been. I told them I'd been in Korea, a Marine, fought in some battles, left it vague. They'd push for details and I'd shut down. Couldn't talk about it. Couldn't share those memories with them. What would I say? That I'd watched friends freeze to death? That I'd killed men in the darkness? That their father was broken in ways they couldn't see? Better to say nothing. Better to be the distant, closed-off father than to burden them with the truth. So I said nothing, and they stopped asking, and the distance between us grew wider. Just another casualty of Chosin, decades removed but no less real. The physical damage was permanent. Lost those 2 toes. Chronic pain from the frostbite that never fully healed. Arthritis in my hands and feet, worse when it was cold. The VA said it was service-connected. Gave me disability payments. Money couldn't fix it, but at least they acknowledged it. The mental damage had no such recognition. Back then, they didn't understand PTSD, didn't have effective treatments. You were just expected to deal with it. Be tough, move on. So that's what we did. Dealt with it alone, carried it silently. Drank when it got too bad. Isolated ourselves when the nightmares were too intense. I'm 87 years old now. 70 years since Chosin. Most of the guys who were there are dead. Each year the reunions get smaller. Fewer of us left who remember. Soon there'll be none. The last witnesses to what happened in those mountains will be gone. Part of me looks forward to that, to not being the one who remembers, to not carrying this weight anymore. Death doesn't scare me. I've been close to it too many times. What scares me is dying without anyone understanding what we went through, without anyone knowing what Chosin really was. The history books call it a tactical withdrawal, a fighting retreat. They talk about the strategic implications, the casualty figures, the military lessons learned. All true, technically, but it misses what mattered. Chosin was 17 days in the coldest hell imaginable. 17 days of fighting an enemy that outnumbered us 10-1 while the cold killed us as efficiently as bullets. 17 days of watching friends freeze to death, of losing body parts to frostbite, of surviving conditions that should have killed us all. We survived. The 1st Marine Division fought its way out of encirclement and made it to the sea. That's what the history says. What it doesn't say is what that survival cost. Not just the casualties, over 3,000 of them, but the cost to those who made it out. The toll on our bodies, our minds, our souls. I survived Chosin, but I've spent the last 70 years paying for that survival, paying in nightmares and panic attacks and the inability to ever feel truly warm, paying in failed relationships and lost jobs and a life lived at the margins because I couldn't connect to normal society, paying in ways that can't be quantified or recognized or understood by anyone who wasn't there. Was it worth it? The question haunts me. We held off the Chinese, bought time for the evacuation of Hungnam, saved civilian refugees, inflicted massive casualties on the enemy. All tactically significant, all strategically important. But I can't help wondering if there was another way, if we had to be there at all. The Korean War ended in stalemate 3 years later. The border ended up roughly where it started. Thousands of Americans died for a status quo. Was Chosin necessary for that? Were those 17 days of hell required to reach the same place we could have negotiated to begin with? I don't have answers. Just questions that have followed me for 70 years. The cold still bothers me. Even at 87, living in a warm climate, I can't stand being cold. Layer up in weather most people find mild. My children think I'm being dramatic. They don't know. Can't know. Can't understand that cold isn't just temperature for me. It's memory. It's trauma. It's Chosin coming back to claim me one more time. I dream about it less now. Age has dulled some of the sharpness. But it's still there, still waiting. Some nights I'll wake up and for a moment I'm back there, back in those mountains, back in the 40 below darkness, back fighting and freezing and dying. Then I'll remember where I am, remember I survived, remember I'm old now, safe, far from Korea. But part of me never left. Part of me is still there, will always be there. Fighting through those mountains, trying to survive, trying to make it to the sea. The frozen Chosin, that's what they call it. The battle where Marines fought the Chinese in the cold and somehow survived. Where we accomplished what shouldn't have been possible. Where we wrote one of the great stories of military history. But for those of us who were there, it's not a story. It's not history. It's our lives. It's the thing that defined everything that came after. It's the weight we've carried every day for 70 years. I'm tired. So tired of carrying it. So tired of being cold. So tired of the nightmares and the memories and the knowledge of what we went through. But I carry it anyway. Because that's what we do. We survive. We endure. We carry the weight because someone has to. Because those who didn't make it out deserve to be remembered. Because Chosin matters, even if the world has forgotten. 70 years later, I'm still that Marine in the mountains. Still fighting. Still frozen. Still trying to reach the sea. Still cold. Always cold. Forever cold.